You are live.
Thanks. Welcome back to Senate Education. We are shifting gears now to go back to H73, an act relating to financing the testing for remediation, the presence of PCBs in schools. This is the bill that we're working from. There is, the House came in, talked through it with us, so did Mr. O'Grady. And we're eager to hear your thoughts on it. So, you know everybody here?
Yes.
You do, okay.
It's a pleasure to be here first time, I guess, this year in your committee. But for the record, my name is Paul Burns. I'm the Executive Director of the Vermont Public Interest Research Group, or VPIRG. VPIRG has a long history. We've been around for 52 years. And for much of that time, we've often been in front of different committees of the legislature to address issues related to chemicals and chemicals' effect on human health. That is one of the many issues that we work on, but we've done a lot of work in that area. Not so often in front of this committee on that topic, but occasionally.
Health and welfare usually?
Yes,
Yeah.
and it's the natural resources, you know,
Right.
But it is worth pointing out that whenever we consider chemicals and their potential effect on human health, we often look first to those populations that are most acutely affected. There's an exquisite risk that comes with small children, for instance, pregnant women, people with immune systems that are compromised for one reason or another. And so we take special interest in settings where children congregate for long periods of time, child care centers or schools being top of the list there. So I say that by way of introduction to myself and to VPIRG. Just personally, I guess I would also say I'm a parent of a 12-year-old in the local schools here in Montpelier. And so I have a keen interest in the quality of the schools. That means the quality of the education and the schools themselves and the infrastructure issues, and have been one of those parents quite engaged in some of these issues. So we were working on lead in school drinking water a few years back. We were happily participating in that process with our school officials who were terrific in that. But obviously, I have a concern about the idea that there could be chemicals of any sort in a school setting that could endanger my child or anybody's child. In addition to the folks who work day to day, year after year in that school setting as well, so the teachers and custodial staff and other staff as well. I'm also aware that my neighbors in Montpelier saw fit to vote down the school budget on town meeting day. I know, as you all do, of the fiscal challenges that schools and our communities and individuals face right now. So none of the issues surrounding this topic are easy. I grant that from the start. But I guess I am here, I think, to say the quiet part out loud, which is the bill before you is not before you because there has been any change in what we know about the threat that PCBs pose to human health or children's health in particular. There is no new science that I am aware of, and I don't think that the legislators in the other body heard that either. I mean, I would welcome it if we somehow just realized that the hundreds of studies that show that PCBs pose a real threat to human beings were somehow flawed, and we now know the truth, and they're not a problem. And so let's back away from testing. I know this doesn't put an immediate pause or stop to all testing. I understand the functions of the bill that is before you, but it does entertain the possibility of a stoppage in that testing, and therefore the stoppage of work to identify real problems and potentially take actions to remediate those problems. And therefore, what it really means is we are entertaining the possibility that for lack of funds or lack of identification of a source of funding for this purpose, we will allow intentionally allow the continued exposure, of kids in school to PCBs, because that's the result. That is the natural result of this legislation if it is passed into law. As I say, it's the quiet part out loud. I I know there are all sorts of problems of finding the funding, but that's the work that has to be done. I think it's appropriate for the administration to identify some possible funding sources, and then there are roles that you all have to play in this. But it doesn't seem to me that the challenge of insufficient funding justifies moving away from a process of identifying the threats that may be there. And I would point out a possibility. I've heard some say, the worst possible thing would be to do the tests, find that there are PCBs in a school, and then not have state funding available to assist that school to do the cleanup. That's bad. I understand that. I don't think that's the worst outcome, though. I can imagine a situation where testing is done and a PCB problem is found in a school, but perhaps not of the scale of Burlington, but more concentrated in a classroom or a section of the school or a custodian's closet or something, where one could make sure that people are not in that area, at least regularly, day after day, and you could protect students, staff, teachers at that school without necessitating the entire school to be shut down and the very drastic remediation that is necessary in some cases. I think that's it's better to know, to be able to take some action, and it is possible that just giving parents that information would allow them to take some steps. But I really think I support this. VPERG supports the legislation as initially passed, because I think there was justification for it. We support the idea that the state should come up with funds to assist those schools in taking action where it is necessary, and obviously to do the testing itself. And we see no reasonable, no compelling justification that moves us away from that, to say that we should now entertain the possibility of stopping that program because it doesn't make anybody safer taking that action, and it could unnecessarily prolong exposure that could result in significant health effects. I think you all know what these health effects are. I mean, I'll share you with written testimony, but I don't think that's probably what you need right now. But it includes cancer, it is reproductive and developmental disorders, and a range of not insignificant health effects, including, again, to pregnant women who it's not unusual for pregnant women to be working in schools as well. So that's a particular kind of exposure that you want to limit if there's any way possible. So that's why I'm here. It is just to represent that public health concern and interest, and to say, unless you found a reason that makes us less concerned about that, then I want to encourage you to do whatever you can to find the way to allow this program, not whether this program moves forward, but how it moves forward. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
I appreciate it. Yeah.
Some of this written soon, but
yeah. And I also will share, I don't know if people saw it in the news, this thing about Coe Hall. I guess University of North Carolina has shut down. Well, I'll let everybody read
it. It's
a
very serious.
I saw a very serious
situation, and it's a lengthy piece. I would encourage the members of the committee to look at that article. Yeah.
Senator Hewitt, please.
Thank you. Thanks for your testimony. So I have a lot of thoughts, a lot of things to say. I'll start with, I obviously don't argue with the science at all. I mean, I can't, I'm not a scientist. So I won't do that. But one thing I have learned being on the Health and Welfare Committee is that we are poisoned in almost every way you can imagine, from the clothing we have on, to the feminine hygiene products we use, to the makeup we put on, to the things that we eat. We all have PCBs in our body. That was one of the first things Dr. Levine told me when we were going through the Burlington situation. So, I struggle with, I don't wanna say the hypocrisy, but it sometimes seems disingenuous that we're focusing solely on schools. When, and I know we are trying to pass legislation that would, limit PFAS and things like that, but this is a huge problem. And for me, our North Star should be absolute toxin-free schools, clean schools with windows, schools with clean air. I mean, the whole 9 yards. We got to get there, right? In the meantime, this is like a really complicated situation, very complicated. And I say complicated because yes, PCBs poison us, as do lots of other chemicals. But especially like in Burlington, for example, when we dug into this initially and we were looking at the exposure levels, 300, what was it? 320 days a year, 12 hours a day, 7 days a week exposure for a 1 in a million chance of getting cancer. It just wasn't accurate for the population that we had in those buildings. And we had high exposure in the tech center, but the high school exposure, we had high PCB levels in the tech center, but in the high school itself, the levels were much lower. So there's that complexity, right? There's also the complexity that we learned being on the task force, the school construction task force, that when you test for PCBs in the air, they vary from not just hour to hour, but it can be minute to minute. I mean, it seems like it's an extremely complex testing program. And so with all of that, and I want to ask you, because I've sat through not hundreds, many hours of testimony from superintendents who are grappling with this issue, but I want to hear from you as to whether or not you've heard from them. And if you have, how much? And I also just want you to think a little bit about the toll on a community, on kids, on teachers, on employees, when a school closes or when it's compromised. Money aside, what are the other factors involved? I understand health, physical health is extremely important, but there are all these other things involved, emotional health. In Burlington, it was, we've got 50% of our kids plus that are free and reduced lunch kids. They live in some of them, frankly, in dangerous, unhealthy environments. So when we were sending them home for months at a time, frankly, I'm more concerned with their well-being there than I was in school. So this is complicated, and anyway, I'll let you speak to everything I just said.
But that is challenging. You're right. These are complicated issues, and there are many factors involved. I think that PCBs are now, at this point, one of the most studied of the toxic chemicals that we have knowledge about and deep concern over. I believe Dr. Levine has in the past been in this chair and talking about these issues here, and he's far better qualified than I am to talk about this. When I last heard him speaking about it, it was for me compelling, and that is, sometimes it is enough. We do have enough information to say that this is one that we should really take seriously. This is one we really should avoid, at least. And I'm not one to say exactly how many parts per million is the appropriate standard, etc. But we have experts. I mean, I would like to say that Dr. Levine and the folks at A&R, have a responsibility to say what is a safe level, recognizing the challenges of testing that you have identified, and I'm not disputing that. It is a real challenge here, and it does vary in temperature. I mean, all sorts of things can affect that. But there are ways. I mean, we got to do the best we can there. And I think, again, we're concerned not even about PCBs as the only chemical in your body. As you pointed out, you're exposed to many different things. You have many different chemicals in your body, and there's oftentimes the synergistic effect, the additive effect of chemical after chemical that can sometimes compromise an immune system that could allow you to be more susceptible to the danger or threat posed by another chemical. I simply think, from what I know, PCBs are in that class of chemicals where action is warranted once you pass a certain threshold. I know Vermont's threshold is different than the federal government's threshold. I'm not suggesting, I'm not the best expert in the world to tell you, here's the number, but to the extent that we move toward a situation where we think that the solution is to pause in testing it all, I'd rather find let's get the best people to agree on the number, the best pathway to remediate, which is not always tearing a school down, how can we deal with this situation most effectively? But I think knowledge is power in this situation. To your point, children home from schools, I honestly think that we have learned more about COVID, just since the initial days. And I am not suggesting that it was inappropriate to move out of this building and other workplaces and things like that. But I think the more we learn about children, it may be we might handle it differently now. And because there you are kind of weighing certain threats to children for not being in school for long periods of time, and that there are real threats there, which is again, not to say that COVID isn't a real threat, but what is the threat to children and so forth. And I don't want to make this a COVID conversation, but I'm saying let's let science help dictate the
I
response.
appreciate your comments for sure. Another thing I've witnessed, just to give you another, I wish you would listen to or been able to hear from the superintendents, but another issue that I've seen, we know that obesity is an issue for kids, very important health crisis, I would say. In one of our schools, which has, the gym, I think, was like a couple parts per billion over the threshold, which I believe was 20 parts per billion. I could be wrong if anyone's listening. For preschool kids. What happened was the first grade parents found out about this 20 parts per billion, and we were 22. Suddenly, they didn't want their kids going to gym class. So their kids weren't able to exercise. They were sitting in the main office with the administrative assistant. I don't know. I just, for me, that's just wrong on so many levels. First of all, they weren't even in that age category, but you also create this kind of panic in the community where people are making ill-informed decisions based on this fear. So anyway, I'm just.
It's challenging. I
I'm saying
think,
another.
you don't mean to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
We organizationally are generally going to come down to the idea that knowledge, allowing parents, allowing the members of the public to have as much information as we can gather is still the right approach. Part of that has to try to be what does the science really best tell us, in this case, and you will run into challenges with that where people either misinterpret or just react in a way as though if my child doesn't go to gym class, then everything is 100%. That's perfect. That's life has risks. We understand that, and I simply think as your other committee were looking at PFAS exposure and other chemicals and daily products, it just makes sense to try to limit exposure where we can, to take a precautionary approach when we have enough data, enough information to lead us to think this is a real threat. So let's take that precautionary approach when we can, and that has to start with data, with information, and in this case, I think testing in schools.
Anything else from Mr. Burns or anything else, Mr. Burns?
No, I thank you for the opportunity. I'm not here to really challenge the concerns that are brought by any other party. There are lots of interested stakeholders here, and I think those are all legitimate positions. I just, at the end of the day, think unless you are learning something about how the risk or threat has changed, and I don't think you're hearing that, then I encourage you to stay the course. And to the extent that you've got to deviate from the course, look at not a pause indefinitely, but a pause for X period of time where you're going to require the administration to come back with what's the plan? How are we going to do this? Instead of just, well, we're not going to do it until money becomes available through some sort of magical means. I just want to encourage your, and I know you will be purposeful, thoughtful about this, and I just appreciate the opportunity to share those thoughts.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. And I will give this, we're gonna hear from, I don't know who we're gonna hear, a colleague of ours sent this around. This is a situation in North Carolina. We reached out to Brian Quinn, but he doesn't feel as a journalist he should come, but we can just set this aside as your evening PCB meeting. We are waiting to hear from Representative Brady, who is going to hopefully zoom in. She has understandably left for the day. So let's take 5 minutes and then we will wait to hear from her and Beth St. James.